And as you know, there's been a major push from the administration to get agencies to share threat intelligence with one another and to get public and private sector to share threat information. So we've asked Linus Barloon, who is the Director of Cybersecurity for the Sergeant at Arms at the U.S. Senate, to come and share his perspectives on both what government can be doing and how to support these initiatives and hopefully share some of the things that he's doing at the Senate. So please help me welcome Linus.
Can you hear me? Well, good evening and thank you. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you this evening. When I was asked to speak, I was also asked to read the document by the Institute for China Espionage Dynasty. And so when I was reading through that document, and then I took a step back and I realized I remembered the organization I work for, politically charged, political things that happen. Then I looked at the attendees and I asked Parham, I said, who's going to be attending? What's the balance? If I could just get a show of hands. Who's here from the federal government, so to speak? Some, others are vendors, I assume, or just interested. So I took those things into consideration. I reread the document, and then I started to think, if I go down this path, it could be very interesting. So I kept it at a very concept level. And what are the things that I can look at it more from a strategic perspective? The other concern that I had, if I wasn't careful in my explanation of that document, you may walk away with the understanding that I just gave you a presentation on taking my kids to the zoo to look at pandas, kung fu kittens, and playful dragons. And so taking a step back, I tried to put something together. It's going to be a little bit more on that concept perspective, just to give you some insight on what we are doing from a concept perspective, and then to move forward. And so good evening. As Parham said, I am Linus Barloon II, Director of Cybersecurity for the Office of the Sergeant at Arms for the U.S. Senate, and I work for the CIO. And me and my staff, we have the challenge of providing proactive, predictive, and adaptive cybersecurity services for the 100 senators and the 40 committees and subcommittees that they support. And we do that whether they're here in D.C., or whether they're in their states, or even when they're traveling across the globe. And so you can only imagine what kind of challenges that our staff has, but with a great staff, solid technology, repeatable process and procedures, it certainly gives us an interesting time on a day-to-day basis, but we sure have a lot of fun doing it. And so before I get into actually some of the points, I do want to make just one point of reference for everyone to understand, especially with this being recorded. And I do have a script that I'm following here. Anything that I share from this presentation tonight is strictly my opinions as a cybersecurity professional for doing this for 14 years. It's not representative of any member, any committee, the Sergeant at Arms or the CAO. This is strictly from my perspective as a cybersecurity professional. And so before I get into the three concepts or the three topics that I wanted to discuss, just a little bit of background on me. I'm a recently retired Air Force officer, retired 2 years ago in 2014. My last assignment was the White House Communications Agency, where I did the same thing for the White House Communications Agency when the president traveled, providing that proactive, predictive, and adaptive cybersecurity service. So if you can imagine a challenge of going from supporting one key leader to now 100 in their capacity, well, the challenges increase as well. Prior to that, I was on the Air Force's red team, the blue team, and the hunt team. And so just to establish a lexicon for everyone that's common understanding, the red team, I was the bad guy. I emulated the threat. I was and followed those same tactics and techniques and procedures that the adversary followed. As a blue teamer, I looked for the vulnerabilities that the adversary could use against an Air Force base or against me. And then as a hunter, I put the two together. How do I sit on an Air Force base network, and how do I look for the adversary? And how do I shut them down? And so then rolling forward again to the White House Communications Agency, and then now looking at where I am today, my commission career really is a culmination of what I'm able to do today, providing that total look from a cybersecurity perspective. And so for my presentation tonight, there are really three things that I just want to talk about. First of all, understanding just what is that cyber backdrop so that we all understand each other. Second one, now that we understand that cyber backdrop, what's the cause for action? What should we do? Things to consider. And then the last point is going to be something for you to consider. Excuse me, for those of you that are also in the federal government that may share an occupation similar to mine, something for you to take back to your organizations, and for you as the defenders, something for you to take back to the organizations that you support as well. And so to begin with the cyber backdrop, I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, but cyber breaches are inevitable. There are some things that we can do, there are technologies we can put in place, but if the adversary really wants that data, they're going to get the data. Again, there are some things that we can do. But let's take a look at a couple of statistics. The average time over target for the adversary is 205 days. That's based on recent study. The good news is it's 205 days, because that's down from the 300-plus days that it was 2 years ago. The bad news is it's still 2/3 of a year before we, as users, as cybersecurity professionals, understand and realize that there's been an adversary on our network doing things. Continuing on, 95% of the breaches involve a sophisticated adversary. So these aren't script kiddies anymore. They're sophisticated adversaries with sophisticated training, with sophisticated plans in place to come for us. 95% of the breaches also involved human error. 78% of the breaches involved tricking the user. So if you were to put that on a spectrum, you've got a sophisticated adversary on one side and the user on the other. So we have a mismatch. Continuing on, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence has stated that cybercrime is now worse than terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and espionage. To continue forward with that, a scientist out of the UK, Dr. Levisley, has stated that hackers pose more of a threat to world security than nuclear weapons. If you look at 2015, there was a range of breaches that occurred. Range of breaches that occurred that we identified, or that we were told, I should say, from the media. This ranged from organizations, whether you were banking, federal government, financial sector, one and the same, the medical sector, small organizations, universities, it didn't matter. Then you have the ones that we didn't know about and we didn't hear about. So to give you a couple of examples, you have Primera with 11.2 million records. You had Anthem with 80 million records. You had OPM with 21.5 million records. What's the common theme amongst all of those? The adversary was using the statistics that I mentioned before to gain access to our usernames, our passwords, our information sitting on that network. What are our plans? What's our next business move? What are all those types of things to do what? To gain that upper hand. To gain more situational awareness on the things that they could use against us. And so now that we have some of those things out of the way, what's the cost for action? As cybersecurity professionals, we need to identify what we can do to better protect our users, the network, the data, the systems, everything connected together, on how we can put things in place to provide better proactive, predictive, and adaptive services. This includes hiring of the right staff. This includes establishing repeatable processes. This includes technologies as well. So it's not just focused on all technology. One of the things that was interesting for me is that when you see a breach, one of the instant responses go by technology, buy technology. But the challenge that we have is that sometimes it's not a technology problem. Sometimes it's a user awareness problem. Sometimes it is the process problem to use the technology that we already have. And so just as I previously mentioned, educating the users is also key. How do we get the users more involved to mention or to understand the threat data that's happening, the events that are happening, to educate them to say, hey, this is where you're vulnerable, this is how you're vulnerable, this is what you're vulnerable to, and then most importantly, what can you do about it? If you include them in part of the solution, they can help you with securing the network as well. We also need to focus on and transition to and away from a compliance-based approach to cybersecurity. How do we focus on risk? We make risk-based decisions every day. How do we do that in cybersecurity? How do we leverage organizations like NIST, like ISACA, like OpenFair, like ISO, like all of those other organizations that have already created a risk management framework for us to use? And the challenge is, now how do we use it? How do we employ that in our own environment? Because not all environments are the same. So by using a multiple of those, you may be able to find that you can do this with agility. More specifically, our next challenge, or a challenge, is how do we identify our users? How do we identify the systems that they're using? How do we identify where they're using those systems or those endpoints to gain access to that data? How do we better understand that environment? Such that once we've identified that, now we can put those security controls in place, both from a technical perspective and a non-technical perspective, to help lower our risk. Once those security controls are in place, now our Security Operations Center, armed with threat intelligence data, can now better detect when something has breached that protective environment or protected environment, and then we can react and we can recover. And by doing so, now the goal and the intent is, how do we reduce that 205 days from something less than 205 to 100 to 50 to a week to a day? To assist, we should also understand that it's difficult to execute this by ourselves. Just as I said before, how do we get our users involved? But then also, how do we partner? How do we partner with peer organizations? So if you look at the legislative branch, you look at the executive branch, you look at the judicial branch, how do we partner within each of the branches? How do we share those use cases, those stories that are potentially similar to each other? How do we partner with academia? How do we partner with research organizations? How do we partner with the labs? How do we partner with those organizations such that we're not all trying to recreate the real for solutions, rather we're leveraging the intellectual property from each other through that sharing. And by doing so, we can come up with more quickly adapted, more quickly implemented mitigation strategies to help thwart the cyber adversary. And so the last point that I'd like to cover tonight is, and again, the concept that if you're in the federal government, similar to myself, consider a partnership in protection. The Senate, over the past 16 months, we've made several improvements to the security of our network, several improvements to the technology and our process and our procedures. But one of the things we've also focused on is the users. How do we educate them? As mentioned before, this is applicable to many organizations. There is so much more to consider than just strictly on technology, and I mentioned that before. How do you focus on the cybersecurity risk? How do you focus on establishing of that framework in your own environment? Organizational transformation to a risk management framework or to a risk-based approach is a huge challenge. Because right now, today, it focuses on how do you identify, how do you protect, how do you detect, how do you react, and how do you recover. But lest we forget, there's also the traditional risk equation, which involves the threats and the threat events, the vulnerabilities that exist on our network, both from a technical and non-technical perspective, the impact associated that if one of those vulnerabilities has been breached by one of the threat events, to now the likelihood of that even occurring. Then when you look at your, again, going back to your identify, protect, detect, react, and recover, those types of things can now be your mitigation strategies that you use to help lower your risk. There's also a need to partner and share threat data. So now that challenge becomes, how do we share that threat data? And how do we share that threat data from at least two different perspectives? One for the user. Most users, when we say things like playful dragon, how are they going to react? When we say kung fu kitten as a cybersecurity professional, how are they going to react? They're not going to understand. They're not going to know it's China. They're going to think it's something at the zoo. So how do we as cybersecurity professionals take and digest that information and bring it to them such that they understand what are the risks associated, again, going back to where are they vulnerable, how are they vulnerable, what are they vulnerable to, and what can they do about it? As with any partnership, there's also the expectation of what I can do for the user and what the user can do for me. So there's that understanding that they should know that me and my cybersecurity staff, we're doing these things to help keep them secure. But then there's also the expectation that when they come to our webinars, they come to our conferences, that they're also taking that information and doing something with it. And so the challenge is now, how do we keep up with the various cyber threat events? This is where automation comes into play. How do we keep up with the thousands and quite honestly millions of threat events that are coming in every day such that we can make sense of what those threat events are, How do we cure them? How do we mature them? How do we understand them such that we can make more quick and agile decisions in our risk management framework? Also with automation, it can also decrease that time. Let technology help validate what that threat data is, such that a group of analysts isn't necessarily doing, rather a smaller group is doing it to help make better decisions. Continuing on with the theme of automation, the automation of threat data and the security functions also assist with developing of the cybersecurity workforce. When you have that more agile ability, the workforce is satisfied with coming to work. The workforce wants to leverage that technology to help use it to help thwart the adversary. And by also doing that, you can also, from a manager's perspective, help to generate standard operating procedures. And when you generate those standard operating procedures, it helps to generate a maturity model for professionalizing of the workforce. And so in closing, as I wrap things up, the advanced cyber threat continues to be a challenge for all of us. Not only for just the federal government, but the international community, the private sector, the commercial sector, and that what I refer to as a soft target, those of us that are at home. Tackling this from a partnership and protection from a cybersecurity perspective means that now we would be able to more quickly, again, because it's not just cybersecurity, but it's also cybersecurity plus the user, be able to deal with the cyber threat. By doing so, by including the users, it also keeps them engaged, keeps them involved, and keeps them as a partner. Now this is something that, hey, this is the reason why I need to change my password. This is the reason why I need to reboot my server after a patch. This is the reason why I have to understand this block. It also helps them understand where are they vulnerable, how are they vulnerable, and what are they vulnerable to. So with my closing statement, I believe we'll have time for one question. Cybersecurity is a constant balance of analysis. It's that constant understanding of what the adversary is doing. Leveraging automation, now we can do that quickly. We can do that more at the speed of cyber. The quicker and more accurate we are, in the end, the more secure we will be.